It's a pleasure and it's a privilege to be here today, to be invited with such an august audience and to talk about some of the very important topics affecting the EU and more broadly the international market. So really appreciate the opportunity. I'm Daniel Maguire. I've been at LCH since 1999, so I've been clearing swaps since the swaps started clearing. I was one of the founders of the Swap Clear service, so for my sins, it's all I really know is clearing of swaps. So this is somewhat personal. I wanted to spend about 10 minutes really not talking about our recent press releases and so on. I want to talk about the European Commission draft proposal from June 13, 2017 with regard to the supervisory architecture for CCPs. That's really where I want to make my focus today. I'll be brief. I'm conscious we have a panel as well. I'm here today spending time and giving the point of view from LCH Group and actually LSE Group more broadly. We have multiple CCPs. We have CCPs in Paris, sorry, a CCP in Paris, in London, in New York, and in the broader group in Italy as well. So really, my perspective is global. I'm coming at this from many different angles because different CCPs, some are in the EU and some clearly are not. So we come at this from slightly different angles perhaps to some of our other colleagues in CCP land. But the core goal for LCH Group, the core goal for LSE Group is that the final text, it is draft at this stage, but the final text actually works for each of the CCPs that we have in each of the jurisdictions they are, but also importantly for the clients and for the members with who we partner and serve. So, to start, we really do welcome the proposal. It's a good starting point, but it's a starting point. I think Danuta mentioned that herself. And there are some areas that we think that really need a little bit more focus in terms of maybe some improvements. And today I'd like to really talk through some of those suggested areas for consideration by the Commission, Parliament, and so on, the authorities. I'm going to split it into two things. I'm going to talk about EU CCPs, and then I'm going to talk about non-EU CCPs, third country, and then just summarize at the end. So to be brief on EU CCPs, we think there are four real areas. Clearly, we'll write all these things in our submission and our letter, but just to give you some color, there are four key areas. The first one is around Article 49. We really welcome a more defined, explicit timeline for approvals. We see this in other jurisdictions that we operate. We operate globally. We think it works. It's good to have that explicit timeline and definition for changes in risk management or in products or services as well. So we really do welcome that from the EU standpoint. Secondly, building on some of the comments already today, the national competent authorities continue to exercise their current supervisory responsibilities under EMIR is something we welcome. For us, and I think really building on maybe some of the points Danuta made, it's vitally important to us that we, in every CCP we operate, are interacting with supervisory and regulatory authorities that are fully competent, knowledgeable, have the skills and provenance and pedigree in these markets. Clearing sometimes is called out to be something very different and exceptional. There are some elements of it, but it's very nuanced, it's very intricate, and it's very important that we, as the EU, more broadly across the globe, we have the right people in the right places interacting with the CCPs for the protection of the financial system. So we welcome this as well. But thirdly, and equally, we do welcome and understand the desire, I guess, from the Commission to get more, let's say, regulatory convergence across the European Union, consistency and convergence across the rule sets and the application of EMIR. So we welcome that, and ESMA is clearly a natural candidate for that role. The final piece will be, very briefly, is the decision-making process or the approval-making process. For us, without getting into all the technical detail, which we can always do, it's just still too elongated. So we'd encourage the Commission to not really do, if I may use an Englishism, a halfway house or half solutions. It really needs to be addressed. So try not to entertain any half solutions that may be consensus for everybody, but actually in practice isn't really a very efficient way of operating. So that's EU CCPs. I'm going to move on to the more thorny topic, perhaps, of third country or non-EU CCPs. And I think there's one word that every time we have this dialogue, every time we look at text, media, and so on, there's one word that keeps coming, it sort of keeps mean reverting to. It's the word systemic. And as it stands, there's no final, very explicit definition of what systemic is. It's not for me to define. I'm going to have a go at explaining our position on that. But right now, the word systemic is very generically outlined. There's a catalogue of things that could make it systemic, but for us it's quite wide and open to somewhat wild interpretation. So we need some specificity and real explicit definition around the word systemic, because it's going to have a very important context as we go forward. CCPs are clearly systemic. Your goal as a CCP is to be systemic. If you're not systemic, you don't have business. So your goal is to be systemic, ironically. Your goal is to be highly regulated. That's called success, because you are systemic. But a CCP isn't necessarily systemic every day of its operations in business as usual. It really becomes really systemic, perhaps under two conditions. One is because of participants, and the other is perhaps because of products. So I'm going to talk about participants first. I think it's very important we have context. There feels sometimes a discussion of a fait accompli that CCPs are going to be in trouble because they are systemic. I think we have to put the context. To get to that point, we need to look at the broader marketplace. In the eventuality of a default, when a CCP actually becomes really systemic to the market, starts trading and closing out the portfolio, what's happened before we get to that point? The first thing that's happened has been a major default, maybe a multiple major default. But what's really happened there is a bank or an asset manager or an entity of material size has defaulted. And if something has defaulted, things, if we bring it to the EU, could be broader across the globe, BRRD, CRR, CRD4, EMIR, NSFR, leverage coverage ratio, Basel, all of these things we've put in place since the crisis have not prevented this institution going into some form of default. So if you think about that context when you consider this, the CCP is really coming in after the authorities, whichever jurisdiction we're operating in, have decided not to save said institution. So our job at that point as a CCP, be it Eric, myself, or others, we're a circuit breaker. We're an independent circuit breaker. And our goal is to prevent contagion and to protect the non-defaulters. And it's the non-defaulters regardless of the jurisdiction in which they operate. Our goal is to protect the non-defaulting institutions across all jurisdictions that are participating in that CCP. Important context. If we go to the product, to echo what Danuta said, I was quite encouraged to hear some of the comments she made. It's really important to distinguish by products. Not every product is the same. It's very easy to see some products may be more systemic than other products. There'll always be different views. That's life. Products that are clearly used for monetary policy transmission within the EU, I can get it. I can see that, and it's hard to dispute that they would not be deemed as systemic. Products that are not necessarily, or second order, or derivatives, perhaps not. So some of the key points is around for the text is to distinguish by asset class, because the remedies by asset class can be different, in our view should be different. Under EMIR, there's a framework already there. Everything we do is authorized under EMIR at the product level. Risk management and default waterfalls are done at the asset class and the product level. This is not new. This is how EMIR is constructed. Secondly, it's actually the markets in themselves. Some are globally integrated liquidity pools. Some markets are very more regional, domestic. And thirdly, there's precedent overseas as well. We operate in many, many different jurisdictions and countries, but we've seen services, asset classes recognized in Canada, Australia, Japan, too many countries, US and others, but it's the service, not the clearinghouse, that is recognized. Obviously, the clearinghouse is the entity, but it's really at the service-specific level that you get that recognition. So we think they need to be considered. So let's try and bring things to conclusion. Should the assessment of systemic be prescribed at the level of product, as I've outlined, at asset class? As we understand it, as I understand it, the Commission requires two things. One is the direct application of EMIR, and two, it requires the direct supervision of ESMA. And to cut to the chase, we're fine with that. We expect that, we encourage that as an organization in any of our CCPs. However, there's one important caveat, the location policy, which is essentially, and again, I'll reference Danuta's comments in her speech, which I had no visibility of prior, but the denial of recognition of a third country service is really what a location policy can be tantamount to. And the quid pro quo of something like that, a denial of recognition or a location policy, is potentially, I don't wish to scaremonger, but potentially a denial of accessibility to third country services by EU entities. So crudely, this outcome, location policy, could lead to some form of partitioning, some form of segregation of EU participants away from some of the internationally integrated marketplaces, and more broadly, the global liquidity pool, which is probably a more efficient way to work. And that fundamentally will reduce choice for EU entities in that extreme scenario. I don't wish to say we get there, but in that scenario, that is an outcome that we think is a non-zero probability. So to conclude, and maybe on a constructive note to close, and then we can pass over to other speakers, we fully support the direct application of EMIR, to repeat. We fully support the direct supervision by ESMA. And we fully believe that there are sensible, sophisticated, and specific and concrete solutions and potentially additional measures to address the concerns of the EU authorities and others, but without penalising the EU entities, and therefore giving choice, which is something we don't think a location policy would do.